The Golden Goose. There was once a man who had 3 sons, the youngest of whom was called the Simpleton, and was despised, laughed at, and neglected, on every occasion, by his brothers. It happened one day that the eldest son wished to go into the forest to cut wood, and before he went his mother gave him a delicious cake and a flask of wine. When he came into the forest, a little old gray man met him, who wished him good day, and said, "Give me a bit of your cake, and let me have a drink of your wine. I am so hungry and thirsty." But the youth answered, "Give you my cake and my wine? I haven't got any. Be off with you." And leaving the little man standing there, he went off. Then he began to fell a tree, but he had not been at it long before he made a wrong stroke, and the hatchet hit him in the arm, so that he was obliged to go home and get it bound up. That was what came of the little gray man. Afterwards the second son went into the wood, and the mother gave to him, as to the eldest, a cake and a flask of wine. The little old gray man met him also, and begged for a little bit of cake and a drink of wine. But the second son spoke out plainly, saying, "What I give you I lose myself, so be off with you." And leaving the little man standing there, he went off. The punishment followed. As he was chopping away at the tree, he hit himself in the leg so severely that he had to be carried home. Then said the simpleton, "Father, let me go for once into the forest to cut wood." And the father answered, "Your brothers have hurt themselves by so doing. Give it up, you understand nothing about it." But the simpleton went on begging so long, that the father said at last, "Well, be off with you. You will only learn by experience." The mother gave him a cake, and with it a flask of sour beer. When he came into the forest, the little old gray man met him, and greeted him, saying, "Give me a bit of your cake, and a drink from your flask. I am so hungry and thirsty." And the simpleton answered, "I have only a flour and water cake and sour beer. But if that is good enough for you, let us sit down together and eat." Then they sat down, and as the simpleton took out his flour and water cake, it became a rich cake, and his sour beer became good wine. Then they ate and drank, and afterwards the little man said, "As you have such a kind heart, and share what you have so willingly, I will bestow good luck upon you. Yonder stands an old tree. Cut it down, and at its roots you will find something." And thereupon the little man took his departure. The simpleton went there, and hewed away at the tree, and when it fell he saw, sitting among the roots, a goose with feathers of pure gold. He was very happy to see that, and he lifted it out and took it with him to an inn where he intended to stay the night. The landlord had 3 daughters who, when they saw the goose, were curious to know what wonderful kind of bird it was, and ended by longing for one of its golden feathers. The eldest thought, "I will wait for a good opportunity, and then I will pull out one of its feathers for myself." And so, when the simpleton was gone out, she seized the goose by its wing, but there her finger and hand had to stay, held fast. Soon after came the second sister with the same idea of plucking out one of the golden feathers for herself. But scarcely had she touched her sister, than she also was obliged to stay, held fast. Lastly came the third with the same intentions, but the others screamed out, "Stay away! For heaven's sake, stay away!" But she did not see why she should stay away, and thought, "If they do so, why should not I?" and went towards them. But when she reached her sisters there, she stopped, hanging on with them. And so they had to stay all night. The next morning the simpleton took the goose under his arm and went away, unmindful of the 3 girls that hung on to it. The 3 had always to run after him, left and right, wherever his legs carried him. In the midst of the fields they met the parson, who, when he saw the procession, said, "Shame on you, girls, running after a young fellow through the fields like this." And forthwith he seized hold of the youngest by the hand to drag her away. But hardly had he touched her when he too was obliged to run after them himself. Not long after the bishop came that way, and seeing the respected parson following at the heels of the 3 girls, he called out, "Ho, your reverence, whither away so quickly? You forget that we have another christening today." And he seized hold of him by his hand. But no sooner had he touched him than he was obliged to follow on too. As the five tramped on, one after another, two peasants came up from the fields, and the parson cried out to them, and begged them to come and set him and the bishop free. But no sooner had they touched the bishop than they had to follow on too. And now there were 7 following the simpleton and the goose. By and by they came to a town where a king reigned, who had an only daughter who was so serious that no one could make her laugh. Therefore the king had given out that whoever should make her laugh should have her in marriage. The simpleton, when he heard this, went with his goose and his hangers-on into the presence of the king's daughter, and as soon as she saw the 7 people following always one after the other, she found that so funny that she burst out laughing, and seemed as if she could never stop. And so the simpleton earned a right to her as his bride. The marriage took place immediately, and at the death of the king the simpleton possessed the kingdom, and lived long and happily with his wife. Thumbelina. There was once a woman who wanted very much to have a child. So one day she went to a fairy and said to her, "I should so much like to have a little child. Can you tell me where I can get one?" "Here is a barley corn for you," said the fairy. "Put it in a flower pot, and then you will see something happen." The woman went home and planted the barley corn. There grew out of it a large and beautiful flower, but the petals were tightly closed as if it was still only a bud. "What a beautiful flower!" exclaimed the woman, and she kissed the red and yellow petals. But as she kissed them the flower burst open, and in the middle of the blossom sat a little girl, quite tiny, trim, and pretty. She was scarcely half a thumb in height, so they called her Thumbelina. But one night, when she was lying in her pretty little bed, which was an elegant walnut shell, an ugly old toad crept in through a broken pane in the window. She hopped onto the table where Thumbelina lay asleep. "This would make a beautiful wife for my son," said the toad, taking up the walnut shell, with Thumbelina inside, and hopping with it through the window into the garden. There flowed a great wide stream, with slippery and marshy banks. Here the toad lived with her son. Ugh! How ugly and clammy he was, just like his mother. "Croak, croak, croak," was all he could say when he saw the pretty little girl in the walnut shell. The tiny Thumbelina woke up very early in the morning, and when she saw where she was she began to cry bitterly. For she was placed on a great green leaf in the middle of the water, and she could not get to the land. The old toad was decorating her room, to make it very grand for her new daughter-in-law. Then she swam out with her ugly son to the leaf where Thumbelina lay. The old toad said, "Here is my son. You shall marry him, and live in great magnificence down under the marsh." Then they took the neat little cradle and swam away with it. But Thumbelina sat alone on the great green leaf and wept, for she did not want to live with the clammy toad, or marry her ugly son. The little fishes swimming about under the water had seen the toad quite plainly, and heard what she had said. So they put up their heads to see the little girl. When they saw her, they thought her so pretty that they were very sorry she should go down with the ugly toad to live. No, that must not happen. They assembled in the water round the green stalk which supported the leaf on which she was sitting, and nibbled the stem in two. Away floated the leaf down the stream, bearing Thumbelina far beyond the reach of the toad. On she sailed past several towns, and the little birds sitting in the bushes saw her, and sang, "What a pretty little girl." The leaf floated farther and farther away. Thus Thumbelina left her native land. A great cockchafer came flying past. He caught sight of Thumbelina, and in a moment had put his arms round her slender waist, and had flown off with her to a tree. Oh, dear! How terrified poor little Thumbelina was when the cockchafer flew off with her to the tree. Later on, all the other cockchafers who lived in the same tree came to pay calls. They examined Thumbelina closely. "How ugly she is," said all the lady chafers, and yet Thumbelina was really very pretty. When the cockchafer heard all the ladies saying she was ugly, he began to think so too, and would not keep her. She might go wherever she liked. So he flew down from the tree with her and put her on a daisy. The whole summer poor little Thumbelina lived alone in the great wood. The summer and autumn passed, But then came winter, the long, cold winter. She was terribly cold. Poor little Thumbelina. She would surely be frozen to death. She came across the door of a field mouse, who had a little hole under a corn stalk. Thumbelina went up to the door and begged for a little piece of barley. "Poor little creature," said the field mouse, "come into my warm room and have some dinner with me." As Thumbelina pleased her, she said, "As far as I am concerned, you may spend the winter with me. But you must keep my room clean and tidy, and tell me stories, for I like that very much." And Thumbelina did all that the kind old field mouse asked, and did it remarkably well too. "Now I am expecting a visitor," said the field mouse. "My neighbor comes to call on me once a week. He is very wealthy, has great, big rooms, and wears a fine black velvet coat. If you could only marry him, you would be well provided for. But he is blind. You must tell him all the prettiest stories you know." But Thumbelina did not trouble her head about him, for he was only a mole. He came and paid them a visit in his black velvet coat. He liked Thumbelina very much and expressed his desire to marry her. A short time before he had dug a long passage through the ground from his own house to that of his neighbor. In this he gave the field mouse and Thumbelina permission to walk as often as they liked. But he begged them not to be afraid of the dead bird that lay in the passage. Thumbelina was very sorry, for she was very fond of all little birds. Thumbelina bent down to the bird and kissed his closed eyes gently. Later, she plaited a great big blanket and spread it over the dead bird, so that the poor little thing should lie warmly buried. Then she laid her head against the bird's heart. But the bird was not dead, he had been frozen, but now that she had warmed him, he was coming to life again. Thumbelina was so amazed to see the bird was alive. "Thank you, pretty little child," said the swallow to her. "I am so beautifully warm. Soon I shall regain my strength, and then I shall be able to fly out again into the warm sunshine." When the spring came, and the sun warmed the earth again, the swallow said farewell to Thumbelina and flew away. "Now you are to be a bride this very autumn, Thumbelina," said the field mouse, "for our neighbor has proposed for you. What a piece of fortune for a poor child like you." But she was not at all pleased about it, for she did not like the stupid mole. Spring and summer passed and the wedding day arrived. The mole had come to fetch Thumbelina to live with him deep down under the ground, never to come out into the warm sun again, for that was what he didn't like. Tweet, tweet, sounded in her ear all at once. She looked up. There was the swallow flying past. "The cold winter is coming now," said the swallow. "I must fly away to warmer lands. Will you come with me? You can sit on my back, and we will fly over the mountains, to the warm countries where the sun shines more brightly than here, where it is always summer, and there are always beautiful flowers." "Yes, I will go with you," said Thumbelina, and got on the swallow's back. Up he flew into the air, over woods and seas, over the great mountains where the snow is always lying. At last they came to warm lands. There the sun was brighter and the sky seemed twice as high. The swallow flew down with Thumbelina and set her upon one flower. But there, to her astonishment, she found a tiny little man sitting in the middle of the flower. He had the prettiest golden crown on his head, and the most beautiful wings on his shoulders. He himself was no bigger than Thumbelina. He was the spirit of the flower. In each blossom there dwelled a tiny man or woman. But this one was the prince. "How handsome he is," whispered Thumbelina to the swallow. When the prince saw Thumbelina, he was delighted, for she was the most beautiful girl he had ever seen. He asked her name, and then invited her to his castle. The prince fell in love with her, so he asked her if she would be his wife, and queen over all the flowers. This certainly was a very different sort of husband to the son of a toad, or the mole. So she said, yes, to the handsome prince. She was gifted then with a beautiful pair of wings, so she too could fly from flower to flower. "You shall not be called Thumbelina," said the prince to her. "We will call you May Blossom." So she married the prince and became the queen of the flowers. Once upon a time there lived a king and queen who had a little baby daughter. They asked all the fairies in the kingdom to the christening, but unfortunately forgot to invite one of them, because it happened that unfortunately there were 13 fairies, and the king had only 12 gold plates for the feast. So he was obliged to pretend he had forgotten the 13th fairy. The 12 fairies came to the christening, and they each brought a magic gift to the infant princess. One gave her beauty, another health and happiness, another cleverness, another sweet temper and a kind heart, and so on until it came to the 12th fairy. But before she could speak, the door flew open, and in there swept the 13th fairy, who had not been invited. She had an ugly frown on her face, and looked so angry that everyone drew back to let her pass. Straight up to the baby she went, and she looked crossly at the little beautiful face. "You shall have my gift, though I was not invited to the christening," she said with a spiteful smile. "When you are 15 years old, you shall prick your finger with a spindle and fall down dead." Then she cast an evil look all round, and flew out of the window. Everyone stood quite silent with grief and horror, until the 12th fairy stepped forward and waved her wand. "I have still a gift to bestow," she said, "and though I may not change the wicked fairy's prophecy, I can at least make it less evil. The princess shall not die when she pricks her finger with the spindle, but she shall fall into a deep sleep, which will last 100 years." Then all the fairies left the palace, and the king and queen began to think that perhaps the wicked fairy had been only a bad dream. But in case any harm should really come to the little Princess Briar Rose, it was ordered that every spinning wheel in the kingdom should be destroyed. And very soon not a spindle was to be found throughout all the length and breadth of the land. Now the fairy gifts which had been given to the princess were seen more and more clearly by mortal eyes as she grew older. She was as beautiful as a flower, and as clever as she was good, and as happy as the day was long. The king and queen thought no more of the evil prophecy, and so the years slipped by until Briar Rose was 15. It happened that on her 15th birthday the king and queen went out together, and the princess was left all alone in the palace, and began to feel very dull, so she thought she would go through all the rooms in the palace and look for adventures. After a while she came to a little turret stair which she never remembered having seen before, and when she climbed to the top she came to a curious little door. The princess knocked and an old cracked voice cried out, "Come in." And when Briar Rose opened the door she saw a little old woman sitting there with a spinning wheel. "Oh, what a funny thing that is," said Briar Rose, looking at the spinning wheel, for she had never seen such a thing before. "How I should love to make it go whirling round and round." And she put out her hand to touch it, but the spindle pricked her finger and a tiny drop of blood sprang out. Before she had even time to cry out, part of the fairy's evil prophecy came true, for she sank down on the stone bench and fell fast asleep. At that very moment everybody and everything in the palace stopped what they were doing, and fell fast asleep too. The king and queen sank down in 2 royal chairs. The cook in the kitchen, who was just going to box the scullion's ears, went fast asleep with her hand still in the air. The scullion, with his mouth wide open, ready to roar with the pain, left it open and went fast asleep too. The horses in the stable went to sleep in the middle of eating their corn. The pigeons on the stable roof hadn't even time to tuck their heads under their wings, but fell asleep as they were strutting around with their tails still spread out. The flies slept on the ceiling. The canary did not want to have the green cover put over its cage, but slept in broad daylight. The fire stopped crackling and burning, the pot stopped boiling, nothing stirred, nothing moved, not a sound was heard. Only round the palace there sprung up a hedge of briar roses which grew taller and taller as time went on, until the palace was quite hidden, and not even the top of the flagstaff could be seen. And as the years went by, people began to forget about the palace. Only the old people would tell the children sometimes about the beautiful princess who once lived in a palace where the briar roses grew. But the children thought it was a make-believe story, for the hedge was so thick and so high that no one could see what was inside. Sometimes a prince would come riding by and listen to the tale, and then try and cut his way through the thick hedge, to see if there was really a beautiful princess on the other side. But the thorns tore everyone who tried to force his way through, and sometimes put out his eyes, so the princess grew tired of trying, and each year the hedge grew taller and thicker. Now it happened that on the very day when the princess had been asleep for 100 years, there chanced to come to that country a prince who was braver and handsomer than any of the princes who had come before. He had never known what it meant to be beaten or to give in, and when he heard the story of the Princess Briar Rose, he made up his mind to find her. But when he got to the great hedge, he found it covered with pale pink roses, and the branches parted in front of him to make a passage, and all the thorns looked the other way. On he walked through the cool, green path, while the roses nodded and smiled on him all the way. And when he came to the other side, he saw a stately palace, just as the old people had described it. Not a sound broke the solemn stillness, not a leaf whispered in the breeze. Then, when he entered the great hall, he saw the king and queen fast asleep on their royal chairs, and everything and everybody were exactly the same as when they had fallen asleep 100 years ago. Presently the prince noticed the turret steps that led to the tower, and he climbed them, just as the princess had done. And when he opened the door and stepped in, he stood still in wonder and delight. The princess lay there fast asleep, her fair face turned towards him, just as she had sunk down to rest 100 years ago. Everything was unchanged except that now around the bed was a canopy of briar roses protecting her as she slept. The flowers breathed their beauty around her, and the sharp thorns guarded her from all harm. So beautiful did the princess look lying there, like a pale rose herself, that the prince was drawn to her side, and bending over her he kissed her cheek. The princess's eyelids quivered, and the next moment her eyes opened. She looked up and saw the prince bending over her, and when their eyes met she gave a little cry of joy. "Oh," she cried, "you have come at last. I have been dreaming and dreaming of you, and I thought you were never coming to wake me." Now the moment the princess opened her eyes, everyone and everything in the palace began to awake too. The king and queen walked with stately tread through the hail, the cook gave the scullion a sounding box on his ear. The scullion roared with his mouth wide open, the horses went on eating their corn, the pigeons strutted about on the roof, the flies walked busily up and down the ceiling. And the great hedge of briar roses sank down and down till it vanished in the earth, and not even a bud was left. "But what does it matter if the roses are gone?" said the prince, "since I have got my own briar rose, who is fairest of them all." And so they were married and lived happily ever after.
The Elves and the Shoemaker. Once upon a time there was a poor shoemaker who lived with his wife. He made excellent shoes and worked quite diligently, but even so he could not earn enough to support himself and his family. He became so poor that he could not even afford to buy the leather he needed to make shoes. Finally he had only enough to make one last pair. He cut them out with great care and put the pieces on his workbench, so that he could sew them together the following morning. His wife asked, "What will happen to us? The cupboards are bare, and we have no firewood. Even our last candle has almost burned away." She was very worried. "Don't worry," said the shoemaker. "Things will work out for us. You'll see, I will finish these shoes tomorrow, and someone will buy them." He cut out the leather and then went to bed. The shoemaker would finish working first thing in the morning. The next morning, he awoke early and went down to his workshop. On his bench he found an exquisite pair of shoes. They had small and even stitches, formed so perfectly that he knew he couldn't have produced a better pair himself. Upon close examination, the shoes proved to be from the very pieces of leather he had set out the night before. The shoemaker called for his wife to come and look at the wonderful shoes. She was just as amazed as he was. "Who could have made these shoes?" she asked. They immediately put the fine pair of shoes in the window and drew back the blinds. "Who in the world could have done this great service for me?" he asked himself. Even before he could make up an answer, a rich man strode into his shop and bought the shoes, and for a fancy price. The shoemaker was ecstatic. He immediately went out and purchased plenty of food for his family and some more leather. That afternoon he cut out 2 pairs of shoes and, just as before, laid all the pieces on the bench so that he could sew them the next day. Then he went upstairs to enjoy the good meal with his family. My goodness! He cried the next morning when he found 2 pairs of beautifully finished shoes on his workbench. Who could make such fine shoes, and so quickly? He put them in his shop window, and before long some wealthy people came in and paid a great deal of money for them. The happy shoemaker went right out and bought even more leather. This continued for many nights, until the shoemaker's shelves were filled with beautiful shoes like no one had ever seen before. Soon his small shop was crowded with customers. He cut out many types of shoes, stiff boots lined with fur, delicate slippers for dancers, walking shoes for ladies, tiny shoes for children. Soon his shoes had bows and laces and buckles of fine silver. The little shop prospered as never before, and its proprietor was soon a rich man himself. His family wanted for nothing. As the shoemaker and his wife sat by the fire one night, he said, "One of these days, I shall have to learn who has been helping us." "We could hide behind the cupboard in your workroom," she said. "That way, we could find out just who your helpers are." And that was just what they did. That evening, when the clock struck 12, the shoemaker and his wife heard a noise. 2 tiny men, each with a bag of tools, were squeezing beneath the crack under the door. Their clothing was old and worn, which made the shoemaker and his wife sad. The elves wore thin, torn pants that ripped and covered with patches. They were making shoes, but they didn't have any for themselves. The next day, the shoemaker's wife said, "Those little elves have done so much good for us. We should make some gifts for them." "Yes," cried the shoemaker. "I'll make some shoes that will fit them, and you make some clothes." They worked until dawn. The presents were laid out upon the workbench, 2 tiny jackets, 2 pairs of trousers, and 2 pairs of shoes. They also left out some plates of good things to eat and drink. Then they hid once again behind the cupboard and waited to see what would happen. Just as before, the elves appeared at the stroke of midnight. They jumped onto the bench to begin their work, but when they saw all the presents they began to laugh and shout with joy. They tried on all the clothes, then helped themselves to the food and drink. Then they jumped down and danced excitedly around the workroom and disappeared beneath the door. After that, the shoemaker cut out his leather as he always had, but the 2 elves never returned. "I believe they have heard us whispering," his wife said. "Elves are so very shy when it comes to people, you know." "I know I will miss their help," the shoemaker said, "but we will manage. The shop is always so busy now. But my stitches will never be as tight and small as theirs." The shoemaker did indeed continue to prosper, but he and his wife always remembered the good elves who had helped them during the hard times. Moral of the story. The moral of the elves and the shoemaker is to be thankful and grateful in life. This short story also teaches us to work hard to make things better and must be thankful for all the help we receive from others. The story also highlights the message of helping those in need. In the story, the little elves helped the shoemaker when they needed it the most. In return, the shoemaker and his wife were grateful for the elves' help and made clothes and tiny shoes as a token of thanks for them.